Okay, so this is the part of the tutorial that gets a lot more interesting. We're actually going to go ahead and allow our users that have registered to log in. Now obviously we haven't actually registered any users, we just have this users table that we placed this data into, which was the username, the password. These are obviously the two important fields in this case, and some other data that we're going to be looking at later. This active field also relates to logging in, because if a user has not activated their account, which we'll look at later by email, then they won't be allowed to log in. So we're going to perform a check as the user logs in to see if this value is 0, and if it's 0 we won't let them log in. If it's 1 we'll go ahead and let them log in. So this is extremely simple. We're going to be using functions that we're going to place inside of our users.php functions file that we created, which is this one here. Remember, that's within our functions folder, and it's called or included with init.php, which subsequently is included at the top of our pages here. So we're obviously dealing with a widget. I've already discussed that we're going to have our login form over here. So the first thing we're going to do is build the aesthetics. So we'll build the form that the users can, fill in and click submit and go somewhere. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to go ahead and open includes widgets, and I'm going to open this login widget here. So what this is it's a widget that goes in the side, and eventually we're going to have some kind of logic to say if the user's not logged in, show this widget, which is going to be the login form, otherwise show the greeting. So let's go ahead and just modify this. I'm going to change the header slightly. I'm going to change this to login/register, and obviously this can be anything you want. Now within here we need a form. So let's go ahead and build the basis for our form. That's the action and the method, and we'll end the form there. So we've now got this form. The action, we're going to post this data to login.php, and the method is going to be post data. So obviously there's differences between post and get data, but I won't go into that just now. If you haven't looked up post and get data already, it's a good idea that you do so. Okay, so I'm going to create an unordered list to display or structure the form, regardless of whether that's your preferred method. I'm going to be doing so. So I've created an unordered list, and I'm going to give this an ID of login. And you'll notice that if we open up our style sheet, which you might have downloaded, you might be using your own styles. Let's go all the way down and find login. There, so we've got login li link. We've got a margin top of 5 pixels. So that's just going to space that out slightly. And also with, let's see, our widget. Oh no, this is just going to display. This is just going to display them top down. So you'll see that we've got general styles for ULs here and everything like that. But anyway, and obviously we've got our resets at the top. So we've got our padding set to 0, our margins, our list style none. So essentially we're creating an unordered list, which would by default have bullet points, but we're not actually showing them. So I'll just demonstrate this actually just by creating the list items. Now how many list items we're going to have? Well, we're going to have 4, which might seem strange at first, but I'll go ahead and explain what these are for. And I just realized I could have duplicated these, but never mind. My text editor allows me to duplicate lines. Okay, so the first one's going to be for the username field and the label as well, although we're just going to write this as text and have a line break. The next one is password, and then we've got the submit button, and then we've got a link to allow the user to click through to register. We've already created the registration page, but there's not much on it. So username, I'm just going to pull this down and indent so it looks a bit nicer, and I'm going to do a line break, and I'm going to create an input field. The type is going to be text, the name is going to be username, and that's all I'm doing. So within the second one we have password, And we're going to do exactly the same as here, but we're going to have the type as password. So we have our browser cover up the characters as we type. We then need a sign in button, so a submit button, sorry. So we're going to have an input with the type of submit, and we'll give this a value as well. So I'm going to say login. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh, and you see we've now got our form. It's looking okay. We can enter data and we can click login, which goes through to login.php. At the moment that's not found because we haven't created that yet, but that's going to be the next stage. So within here we need to create this link to ask the user to register, or give the option to register. So that's going to link through to register.php. So when I refresh and I click this, we go through to the register page. And notice obviously this still stays the same because the use var includes. Okay, so we've actually finished this form now, so I can go ahead and close that. We don't need that up anymore. The files that I'm going to be dealing with now, if I'm going to leave init.php open because we're going to deal with that at some point. We don't really need index.php open, it's not really relevant. We're going to be previewing it in our browser, but we're going to be working on the login.php file, which we haven't created yet. So let's go ahead and create a file, login.php. This is in the root directory along with our normal files. And this is the file that processes the username and the password and goes off and calls different functions and says, does this user exist, or has this login been successful, or is this user active, so is their account active yet? All them kinds of things this file is going to deal with. So the one thing that we need to do is we need to think about error handling as well. How are we going to handle the errors that we pass through PHP, and say I don't enter anything in the form and I just click submit. I want to be able to say to the user, you need to enter a username and password. And we do this. I'm going to create a variable at the top of init.php, and this is just going to be a sort of global, it's not going to be a global variable, but it's going to be a variable that's going to be accessed by every page, and it's going to be an array called errors. Now this might seem odd at first, but it's just going to be my method of checking through errors and logging any errors we find. So you'll know why I've done this in a moment when we get down to the nitty gritty in login.php. Okay, so we obviously need to access specific functionality within login.php, and we need to access within our core directory our users functions. Now we're obviously not going to include our users functions file directly in here, but we are going to go ahead and we're going to include core/init.php. So we're including our core files. So now when I go ahead and click login, we go through to this page, nothing happens because there's no content on here yet. Okay, so what do we need to do now? Well, we need to go ahead and process this login. So let's just go over to our login widget, just so we can see the names of the fields. So we've got, I didn't change that one. Good thing I opened that up again. So we've got a username with the name of username. This is the name that we're going to use to access it within PHP, and the same with password as well. So within login.php, what do we need to do? Well, when we click, we go through. We need to say if something. So we say if empty $_post is equal to false. I'm using the triple equals operator, which is essentially checking for type as well. You don't need to do a triple equals, but I prefer to. We're now going to define two variables, which are username, and that's going to equal something here, and password, and this is going to equal something here. And the two things that they equal are the posted values. So $_post username, and here $_post password. So let's just go ahead and test this out. I'm going to go and echo username, and then I'll just echo, I'll pop a space on there, and I'll do password. So let's go back to our page, and I'm going to type in Alex and password. Log in, and you see we've got Alex and then password, or password. Okay, so we know that that's now transferring the data that we type in this form and we're able to pick it up within this file. Obviously we don't want to echo this data out to the user, we want to start checking things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check whether the username or the password is empty, i.e. if they haven't typed anything in either of the fields, because we require both fields. So I'm going to say if, and inside of here I'm going to say empty, so we're checking if empty, or if the username is empty, or empty password. And we can always use a comparison here. We can say equals 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 true. It's entirely preference, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so what happens if the username and password is true? Well, we need to log an error somehow. So I'm going to append a value or append an element onto this errors array that I created up here. Okay, so if you're unsure how arrays work, you may be coming from another language, in which case you probably will do if you've looked at arrays. In PHP they're relatively straightforward, so we would just say errors and then these two brackets, and we're basically saying now append on this value here. So if the username or password is empty, the error will now contain this value here, but we don't want it to just say value, we want it to display the error. So you need to enter a username and password. That's relatively straightforward. Now we're not actually going to display any data out here because we need to create some kind of function to output our errors. So all this is actually doing is it's storing these line after line of errors within this errors array. And the reason we do this is because we may have 4 or 5 errors, or 2 or 3 errors, or 10 or 15 errors. So we want to display them out in an order to the user. So that's not it. We need to say else if something. So if the username or password isn't, it is there, it does exist, we want to go ahead and check if the user exists, because if the user doesn't exist, there's no point even bothering to go ahead and try and log them in. So we're going to use the user exists function, which we need to create ourselves, so it's not a built-in function. Now if this equals false, then we need to log an error. Okay, but we also need to pass a parameter in here. So I'm sort of jumping the gun a bit. I'm passing things in when I haven't even created the function yet. But it's a relatively straightforward function. It will just count in our database if our user exists. So we'll create a query in a moment, and we'll sort of display feedback some information here. So we're going to pass through the username, and that's basically going to check whether this user exists or not. So if the user doesn't exist, we need to again append an element onto this errors array, and I'm just going to say we can't escape that character, find that username, let's just say have you registered. Okay, so now we're at the point where we can't really test the page because this function here does not exist. So we need to jump over to our users.php file and create this function. So let's go ahead and outline the function. Again, if you haven't dealt with functions before, it's a good idea that you do so. So the function is going to be called user exists. And we need to define what we want to pass through here, and that's the username. So we can just go ahead and say username. Now within this function we need to return true or false based on whether the user does exist or not. So we need to create a query, and that's going to be equal to the MySQL query function, which is going to send a query string to our MySQL database and return some data. So in this case I'm going to say select count. So I'm counting a specific field. Now we're selecting from the users table. Let's just jump back over to our database table here. We're counting the user ID, so we're just picking the index to count really, user ID. And we're counting from users, so we're counting from the table users here. Remember, these are backticks, but when we use string data we use single quotes, so you'll see in a minute how this changes slightly. So we're selecting count, basically the count from users, where the username is equal to single quotes, not backticks, and then in here we just replace the variable, so username. Okay, so we've passed through a username, and we have basically injected this into the string. Now there is one problem here, and this is security. Now I'm not going to go too much into SQL injection, but as this stands, it's relatively insecure because this value here can be passed through to make it seem as if the query's, well, it can essentially modify the structure of the query. And again, we have videos on that, so you know, that's a good thing to watch. But I'm going to create a general function to sanitize data, and this will just you know, this will just escape any characters that aren't meant to be passed to a query string. So this function that we're going to create is going to sanitize the data. I'm going to leave this video part as it is for now, and we'll go ahead and do this in the second part of this same video chunk. So I'll join you in that part, or join me in that part for doing that.